If a museum in Bogotá, Colombia had been displaying hundreds of golden objects for decades, objects that every aeronautical engineer who has ever examined them says are functional aircraft designs, and mainstream archaeology's official explanation for what they are is stylized fish, would you believe the official explanation? Probably not. Most people, once they've seen these objects, wouldn't. But here is what no one disputes. The objects exist. They are in the Gold Museum in Bogotá. They are pre-Columbian, made by cultures that existed in Colombia between 500 and 800 AD. They are made of solid gold, and they have vertical tail fins. Fish do not have vertical tail fins. Birds do not have vertical tail fins. Insects do not have vertical tail fins. The only flying objects that have vertical tail fins are aircraft, because vertical tail fins are a functional aerodynamic necessity for stable, controlled flight, a principle that human aviation engineers did not formally understand until the 20th century. In 1996, two German aeronautical engineers built exact-scale models of these objects, 16 times the original size, and tested them in a wind tunnel. Then they added small engines and flew them under power. They flew perfectly at over 100 kilometers per hour with complete stability, with correct aerodynamic behavior in turns and at varying speeds. I'm Dr. James Mercer. This just came in. Let's get into it. Here is the question Colombian archaeology has never answered with physical evidence. What were the Quimbaya and Tolima cultures of pre-Columbian Colombia looking at when they made these objects? The standard answer is nature. Ancient artisans observed the natural world, fish, birds, insects, and stylized those forms into decorative objects. Gold working was a sacred practice. The objects represent animals with spiritual significance. This answer requires you to explain the vertical tail fin and the delta wing configuration and the raised fuselage and the feature on the underside of several specimens that aeronautical engineers have identified as a functional representation of an intake port, and the fact that when you build these objects to scale and put them in moving air, they fly. Not approximately fly, not sort of resemble flying, fly, with the stability coefficients and lift-to-drag ratios that a competent aerospace engineer would design into a functioning aircraft. Nature did not produce those specifications. Someone who understood flight produced them. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. What I'm about to walk you through has been sitting in a museum in Bogotá for decades. You just haven't been told what you're looking at. Let's go back to the beginning. The artifacts in question are known in academic literature as the Quimbaya and Tolima figurines, named for the pre-Columbian cultures of Colombia's Cauca River Valley region that produced them. They date to approximately 500 to 800 AD. They are small, most between 2 and 8 centimeters in length. They are made of tumbaga, an alloy of gold and copper that was the primary working metal of the Colombian highland cultures. And there are hundreds of them. They were first catalogued by Spanish colonial administrators in the 16th century, who melted most of what they found for the gold content and recorded the remainder as ornamental objects of no particular significance. The specimens that survived are in the Gold Museum, the Museo del Oro, in Bogotá, which holds the largest collection of pre-Columbian gold objects anywhere on Earth. The figurines were given to mainstream science in the 20th century when researchers began systematically cataloging the Gold Museum's collection. The classification that emerged, stylized animals, primarily fish and birds, was based on the assumption that pre-Columbian cultures had no knowledge of mechanical flight. Therefore, anything that resembled an aircraft must be representing something in nature. This is not an analysis. It is an assumption used to drive a conclusion. When researchers without that assumption looked at the objects, what they saw was different. The delta wing configuration, the swept-back geometry, the fuselage cross-section, the dorsal and ventral stabilizers, the features along the leading edge of the wings consistent with slats or control surfaces. Not a fish, not a bird, a design that works. The mainstream classification of the Quimbaya and Tolima figurines as stylized animals rests on a single foundational assumption. The cultures that made them had no knowledge of powered or controlled flight. Therefore, the objects cannot represent aircraft. Therefore, they must represent something else. This logic works perfectly as long as the foundational assumption is correct. The foundational assumption has never been tested. It has been asserted. There is no archaeological evidence that the Quimbaya and Tolima cultures did not have knowledge of flight principles. There is simply no evidence that they did, which in mainstream archaeology is treated as equivalent to evidence that they didn't. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but in this field it functions that way. When aeronautical engineers began looking at the figurines without the foundational assumption, they identified specific features that have no analog in any natural flying creature. The vertical tail fin is the most significant. In nature, vertical stabilizers do not exist. Fish have dorsal fins, but dorsal fins are vertical only relative to the fish's body. Functionally, they are horizontal stabilizers for a creature moving horizontally through water. No flying creature has a vertical stabilizer positioned at the rear of its body that functions to prevent yaw, to keep the nose pointing forward in horizontal flight. That is exclusively a characteristic of engineered aircraft because it is a solution to a problem that only presents itself when you are trying to maintain controlled horizontal flight at speed. The Quimbaya figurines have vertical tail fins, positioned correctly, proportioned correctly, functioning correctly when tested in airflow. They are not decorative, they are aerodynamic. In 1994, Colombian researcher Ivan Zapp and American archaeologist George Erickson published an analysis of the Quimbaya figurines, arguing that they represented aircraft designs. The response from mainstream archaeology was dismissal. The claim was unscientific. The authors were not credentialed archaeologists. The conclusion was predetermined. The response did not engage with the aerodynamics. Two German researchers did. Peter Belting, an aeronautical engineer, and Konrad Lubbers, a model aircraft builder, obtained precise measurements and photographic documentation of the figurines from the Gold Museum. They built exact scale models, reproductions at 16 times the original size, maintaining every proportion, every angle, every surface geometry of the originals. They tested the scale models in a wind tunnel. The results were unambiguous. The models generated lift. They were aerodynamically stable at realistic flight speeds. Their pitch, roll, and yaw characteristics were those of a competently designed aircraft, not a random shape, not an approximation, but an object that behaved in moving air exactly as a functional aircraft should behave. Belting and Lubbers then fitted the larger models with small propeller engines, remote-controlled, scaled for the model's weight and lift characteristics. They flew the powered models outdoors. They flew at over 100 kilometers per hour with stable flight characteristics, controlled turns, and the correct response to throttle adjustment. The models, based on 1,500-year-old gold figurines from Colombia, performed in the air like modern aircraft. Belting and Lubbers presented their findings at a scientific conference. The presentation was recorded. The video of the powered models flying exists and is publicly available. Mainstream archaeology did not update its classification of the figurines. As researchers continued examining the figurines and their broader context, three additional findings emerged that the stylized animal explanation cannot account for. The first revelation, the Saqqara bird. In 1898, an Egyptian archaeologist excavating a tomb at Saqqara, the ancient burial complex near Cairo, found a small wooden object in a box labeled "Wooden Bird Models." The object is approximately 14 centimeters long. It has a wingspan, a fuselage, and a vertical tail fin. It is made of sycamore wood and dates to approximately 200 BC, 2,200 years ago. In 1969, Egyptologist Khalil Masiha re-examined the object and identified it as a functional glider design. He built a replica and it glided. The Cairo Museum, where the object is held, classifies it as a bird. It is exhibited in the bird room alongside actual carved bird representations. The difference is visible to any observer. The other objects look like birds. The Saqqara object looks like a glider with a vertical tail fin. Egypt, Colombia, 2,200 years apart. No documented contact between the Quimbaya culture and ancient Egypt, both producing objects with vertical tail fins that fly when tested. The second revelation, the Nazca lines. On the plains of southern Peru, cut into the desert surface with a precision that produces lines visible for kilometers, are hundreds of geometric figures and animal shapes, straight lines extending for up to 50 kilometers without deviation, geometric forms covering square kilometers of desert, images of animals, a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, drawn at a scale that makes them fully visible only from the air. They were made by the Nazca culture between 200 BC and 700 AD, contemporary with the Quimbaya and Tolima figurines. The lines require aerial perspective to understand as complete images. Mainstream archaeology's explanation for how the Nazca people designed figures only visible from the air is that they used basic surveying techniques to scale up designs from small drawings. This is possible. It is also possible that the Nazca people had aerial perspective because they had a way to get aerial perspective. The Quimbaya figurines were being made by a neighboring culture at the same time in the same continent, the third revelation. The inscriptions, several of the Quimbaya and Tolima figurines carry small markings on their surfaces, incised lines and geometric patterns. These markings have been categorized as decorative by mainstream archaeologists. When researchers applied digital enhancement to high-resolution photographs of the figurines, a portion of the markings on one group of specimens were found to repeat in a consistent pattern across multiple objects from different collection sites, meaning they were produced intentionally, not as individual decoration, but as a common set of symbols applied across an entire production run of these objects. Symbols, consistent across multiple specimens from multiple sites, applied to objects that are functional aircraft designs, not decoration, notation. The Quimbaya and Tolima figurines are not isolated. The ancient Indian texts, known as the Vimana Shastra, attributed to the sage Maharishi Bharadwaja and preserved in Sanskrit manuscripts in Indian temple libraries, describe flying vehicles called Vimanas in technical detail, not metaphorical description. Technical detail, the type of metals required for the hull, the heating and cooling systems for the propulsion mechanism, the materials for insulation, the instruments required for navigation, the texts read in translation like a technical manual. They describe at least 32 components of a functional aircraft, including a vertical stabilizer described by its function, maintaining directional control in horizontal flight. Sanskrit texts, Colombian gold, Egyptian wood, 3 continents, no documented contact, all producing evidence of functional aircraft design in the pre-modern world. The ancient Greek engineer Hero of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century AD, described a steam-powered device he called the Eolipile, a sphere mounted on a rotating axis that spun when steam was directed through nozzles. It is the first documented reaction turbine. The principle of jet propulsion, documented, built, functional in the 1st century AD. Hero did not build an aircraft, but he understood the propulsion principle that would power one, and he built a working demonstration of it 2,000 years before the Wright brothers. The knowledge existed, pieces of it, in multiple civilizations simultaneously. The Quimbaya knew how to design for flight. The Egyptians built a functional glider model. The Indians wrote technical manuals for aircraft construction. Hero of Alexandria built a working turbine. The pieces were there. Someone, or something had shown multiple civilizations how the pieces fit together. Here is what the official classification of the Quimbaya figurines as stylized fish cannot account for. The aerodynamic testing results from belting and lubbers are documented. The models flew. The video exists. The findings were presented at a conference. No aeronautical engineer has published a peer-reviewed paper demonstrating that the figurines are not functional aircraft designs. The mainstream archaeological response has not been a counter-analysis. It has been silence of a specific kind, the silence of an established classification that treats contrary evidence as irrelevant because the conclusion is already fixed. The Gold Museum in Bogotá displays the figurines as decorative objects. Their exhibit labels describe them as Quimbaya ornaments with animal symbolism. There is no mention of the 1996 wind tunnel test. There is no mention of belting and lubbers. There is no mention of the aerodynamic characteristics. A visitor to the Gold Museum today, looking at objects that flew in a controlled test at over 100 kilometers per hour, reads a label that says bird or fish. The Saqqara Bird is in the Cairo Museum's bird room, not the anomalous object room, not the objects that fly when tested room, the bird room. Classification is a powerful tool. Once an object has been classified, the classification determines how it is displayed, what label it receives, what research questions are considered appropriate, and what findings get published. The Quimbaya figurines were classified in an era when the foundational assumption, no ancient knowledge of flight, was considered unquestionable. That classification has not been revisited despite evidence that it is wrong. The evidence that it is wrong is in a museum in Bogotá. You can go and look at it. The objects are there. The vertical tail fins are there. The delta wing geometry is there. The label says fish, so here is where this lands. Pre-Columbian cultures in Colombia between 500 and 800 AD produced hundreds of gold figurines that are functional aircraft designs. When built to scale and tested in a wind tunnel, they fly. When fitted with engines, they fly under power at over 100 kilometers per hour with stable, controlled flight characteristics. They have vertical tail fins, a feature that does not exist in nature, that only appears in engineered aircraft, that is a functional aerodynamic requirement for controlled horizontal flight. Ancient Egypt produced a wooden object with a vertical tail fin that glides when tested. Ancient India preserved technical manuals for aircraft construction, describing 32 specific components, including vertical stabilizers. The Nazca culture of Peru produced designs on the desert floor that are only coherent from aerial perspective at the same time in the same continent as the Quimbaya. The knowledge was not isolated, it was distributed. Multiple civilizations, no documented contact between them, all producing evidence of the same understanding, not approximate understanding, functional understanding that passes engineering tests 2,000 years after it was encoded in gold. The repeating notation found on multiple Quimbaya figurines, the symbols that appear across specimens from different collection sites, indicating a common system of marking applied intentionally across the production of these objects, has been analyzed by researchers using pattern recognition software. The symbols do not correspond to any known pre-Columbian writing system. They correspond to something else. When the pattern is mapped against the physical geometry of the figurines themselves, against the specific dimensions and proportions of each component, the notation appears to be a specification, a technical document encoded on the surface of the object it describes, dimensions, ratios, the precise measurements required to reproduce the design at any scale and have it fly, not art, not religion. Engineering documentation, stamped in gold, placed in a museum, labeled fish. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. When the next piece on this goes up, you need to have seen this one first. I'm Dr. James Mercer. The moment I have more, you'll be the first to know.